This is US foreign policy in the 21st century, and we are on class number 9, in which I'm going to talk a little bit about the United States and its influence in Asia and the Pacific. And we begin with a headline: Trump's China car tariffs claim sows confusion. So confusion meaning creating confusion, being misleading on the other side. The subheading below the picture, obviously we've got a nice picture here of Donald Trump shaking hands. Trump with a very cheesy grin on his face, with the Chinese leader, President Xi Jinping. And the subheading: a proposed cut by China to tariffs on US car imports created confusion in Washington a day after it was announced by US President Donald Trump. This is actually quite a slightly old headline. I think I may well have used it in the class last year, but it does touch upon a very obvious and important dimension to the American-Chinese relationship, and that is trade. The fact that the United States and Chinese economies are very heavily integrated, to the point at which at least one or two economists have sometimes today refer the economies as being Chi-Merica. This idea that the American and Chinese economies have become so interdependent that they have become virtually inseparable. As we are witnessing at the moment, that creates advantages, but it also creates significant risks, this level of interdependence. And maybe we will touch upon that a little bit later, because I think we almost certainly have a headline referring back to some of the comments that President Trump has made in relation to China and the spread of the virus, the global pandemic that we are all living through currently. Another aspect of American foreign policy is reflected in this cartoon here. We have a television screen and Trump proclaiming fire and fury. This was a famous remark that Trump made shortly after he became president. So I think this was back in 2017. In response to the fact, I think, that North Korea had launched a missile, or maybe conducted a nuclear test. And Trump famously threatened that if North Korea continued along these lines, they would experience fire and fury, the like of which the world had never seen. So a very sort of belligerent, very aggressive response. And yes, back in 2017, there were genuine fears that perhaps Donald Trump was preparing to launch some kind of war against North Korea. Again, we'll talk a little bit about that in a bit more detail when we consider America's relations with North Korea. The people watching the television here responded with chills and worry, and yeah, I think that sort of did reflect a large part of the world's response to Mr. Trump's rhetoric back in 2017. I think there were genuine fears that a war between the United States and North Korea was looking quite possible. And one of the comments that was made was that one of the observations that was made was that a war between North Korea and the United States would have been incredibly destructive. And again, we might come back to that. Okay, before we do that, let's have a quick look at the map. First thing to say about the United States is that it is an Asian power. So although there is an ocean separating the United States geographically from Asia, nonetheless, when you look at relations between Asian states, the United States has an incredibly important presence in the region. Should also be noted, you have the Bering Straits and which is a narrow channel of sea separating Alaska, which obviously is part of the United States, and Russia. Sarah Palin, John McCain's the vice presidential candidate back in I think it was 2012, wasn't it? Who famously said she could see Russia from her window. Well, actually, yeah, there isn't a vast distance between Russia and the United States in Alaska. You also have the Aleutian Islands, a chain of islands extending from North America out towards Asia. So in some ways, yeah, geographically, the United States is not that far removed from Asia when you look at it from that particular perspective. More significantly, though, the United States has an actual physical presence in Asia in the shape of several very important military bases. Okay, looking at our map then, let's consider, I think, the usual question I would ask in the classroom would be, which countries could be considered to be America's friends and which countries does the United States have a more, let's say, adversarial relationship with? Let's start with the friends. And perhaps beginning with the United States' most important ally in the region, and I would say that is almost certainly Japan. Again, we'll get on into a bit more detail about the history between the American-Japanese relationship. A couple of quick observations. Obviously, the United States went to war against Japan in 1941 after the Pearl Harbor attacks. And it ended with a crushing defeat for Japan. So Japan surrenders August 1945. The United States drops 2 atomic bombs on Japan in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the only time that nuclear weapons to date, thankfully, have ever been used in warfare. And as a consequence, Japan is compelled to surrender in 1945, leading to Japan's occupation by American forces. One key difference between America's occupation of Japan, though, and the occupation of Germany is that in the case of Japan, the United States is the sole occupying power. In other words, there are no other powers on Japan, whereas in the case of Germany after 1945 there are 4 powers, United States, Russia, Britain and France. In the case of Japan, it's just the United States, so no other country has a presence in Japan. And it is the United States that basically oversees Japan's transition from being an empire in which the Japanese emperor had absolute authority to Japan effectively becoming a constitutional monarchy. So the emperor remained in place, but Japan becomes a democratic state after the Second World War. And you see the Japanese economic miracle in the 1950s and 60s, where Japan basically becomes the world's second largest economy in the decades after the Second World War. One final point, again, we'll get onto the history in a bit more detail in a moment, but one final point is that a legacy of the American occupation is that the United States retains several important military bases in Japan, probably the most significant of which is on the island of Okinawa, which again is part of Japan. It's one of the smaller Japanese islands, but that today is basically one big American base. And again, looking at the map, one thing that is notable about Okinawa is that it is quite far from the Japanese home islands. So if you like, mainland Japan, if I can put it that way, but not that distant from, first of all, China. Almost sort of equidistant between China and Japan in that sense, and not that geographically removed from Taiwan as well, which again is a significant part of, if you like, the kind of Asian security system. Okay, moving on quickly. The next important ally of the United States is South Korea. The Korean Peninsula obviously still divided between a communist North Korea and a democratic South Korea. The American presence in Korea dates back to 1950 with the outbreak of the Korean War. When North Korea invades the South, I should say, the Korean Peninsula had been divided at the end of the Second World War between, as I say, communist North, non-communist South. 1950, North Korea invades, and the United States responds by sending military forces to fight in order to defend South Korea, leading to a 3-year war, which ends in 1953, mainly, I think, because of Stalin's death. The new Soviet leadership decide that they want to end the war, and a ceasefire is declared in 1953 along the current, as a demarcation line between North and South. Since 1953, though, the United States has retained a very sizable military presence in South Korea. So again, South Korea has become an extremely important sort of base. So again, America has, a very strong sort of physical presence in the shape of military forces on the Korean Peninsula. Again, South Korea not that far, obviously, from China. And not that far from Russia either. Vladivostok, very much within that neighbourhood. To which we can also add Russia as being a sort of Asian power. Obviously, Russia, like the United States, massive continental power stretching from Europe right into East Asia. Should be noted that East Asia, the Russian part of East Asia, is comparatively underpopulated, so not many Russians live in the region. And there is actually quite a big Chinese community which has sort of spilled over the Chinese frontier into Russia. But again, Russia itself is also sort of has a marked presence in the region. But yeah, in terms of allies of the United States, certainly Japan and South Korea would probably be at the top of the list. Then you've got America's relationship with Taiwan. Again, maybe I'll talk a little bit about the history of that when we discuss China. But for now, I think it's enough to say that although the United States does not officially recognize Taiwan as being a sovereign state, Taiwan nonetheless is a sort of American protectorate in the sense that the United States has basically given Taiwan a sort of security guarantee. So Taiwan is heavily dependent upon the United States for security, not least because, of course, Communist China actually claims Taiwan to be part of its territories. Then, of course, you've probably got the most significant bilateral relationship that the United States has, certainly in Asia, probably now across the world as well, and that is America's relationship with China, which, to put it mildly, is complicated. We've already noted China is a massive trading partner for the United States. So, the two countries economically are very, very tightly intertwined. Again, we'll get onto the history of that. But China remains, notionally at least, a communist country. So there's a clear sort of ideological divide. It's obviously not at all democratic. And increasingly, China has become a sort of strategic competitor of the United States. And this, I think, has become very apparent in the last 10 years or so. So obviously there is much sort of discussion about how America's relations with China are likely to develop. Looking further eastwards, you've got India, again another rising power. I'm not going to talk much about Central Asia. We're gonna keep the focus on East Asia today, so I'm not really going to bring India into the discussion. But it's worth noting, of course, India as well is is very much a sort of rising Asian power, Central Asia in the case of in the case of India. Should also be noted that relations between China and India historically have been quite strained. So you've got two big powers which can view themselves as rivals. Although there is a sort of geographical barrier separating India from China in the shape of the Himalayas, this massive mountain range, which is probably the single biggest reason as to why there hasn't been more conflict between China and India. I think there's only been one brief war between the two countries, and even then the fighting was rather limited. And I think the fact is that it's almost impossible to fight along the mountain range which separates the two countries. So that physical barrier between China and India, as much as anything, has kept the two countries apart. Southeast, you've also got Vietnam, again a communist country, but also it has become quite an important trading partner of the United States. Again, there's been a long and complicated history between the United States and Vietnam, and I'm sure I will touch a little bit on that in a moment. Okay, a couple by way of an introduction. First of all, as we said, the United States is an Asian power, and really it has been one, certainly, well, possibly from the mid-19th century, when the American frontier finally extends all the way to the Pacific. So when American settlers begin to arrive in California and hit the Pacific. Certainly by the late 19th century, though, that the United States begins to sort of project its influence into the Pacific and then into Asia. End of the 19th century, you have the Spanish-American War. One consequence of that is that the United States, as I say, that annexes Hawaii, which is right in the middle of the Pacific, and becomes an important American naval base. And also the Philippines, which effectively becomes an American colony in the first half of the 20th century. So already it's beginning to become apparent that the United States is projecting its influence into the region. An important element in American policy at the beginning or first half of the 20th century is that the United States insists that there must be an open door in China. What that basically means is that the United States says that China should be open in terms of trading relations with all powers. So it becomes an important aspect of American policy to prevent one single power dominating China. Should be said, of course, early 20th century, well, really until the Second World War, China politically is unstable, a very weak state. And, there were fears that ultimately China could end up being partitioned, being divided between a number of different powers. And then you've got the American relationship with Japan as well. And America plays a very important role in bringing Japan into integrating, if you like, Japan into the international community. It is the American Navy that is chiefly responsible for opening up Japan until the late 19th century, or mid to late 19th century. Japan is basically a closed state, a feudal society, but it is, as I say, the American Navy which begins to open up Japan. Commodore Perry's mission to Japan. And Japan's first exposure, if you like, to the outside world has a transformative effect. The Japanese basically recognize that they are going to have to modernize, and modernize very quickly if they want to ensure that they don't effectively become a sort of Western colony. And late 19th century, for Japanese, Japan basically transforms itself from being, as I say, a feudal society an agrarian society into a modern industrial state, to the point at which by the beginning of the 20th century, Japan has become a sort of regional power in its own right. This is evident when Russia goes to war with Japan at the beginning of the 20th century, 1905, I think, and the Japanese inflict a very serious defeat on Russia. The Japanese Navy basically sinks a load of Russian ships, and that is very much, reflects the fact that, as I say, Japan is now an important player on the world stage. So even before World War II, it was becoming evident that the United States was going to play was playing a significant role in Asian affairs. But it's World War II which I think really which is mainly responsible for transforming America's position in the region, or if you like, entrenching, maybe that's a better word, entrenching America's position within the region. The United States enters the war against Japan in 1941 after the Japanese attack in Pearl Harbor on Hawaii, Pearl Harbor being an important American naval base. And as I mentioned earlier, the war ends with the United States basically occupying Japan. And one of the legacies of the war, again, as I noted when we were looking at our map, is that the United States comes out of the war with a number of important military bases in the Pacific. So the United States basically has a forward presence in the Pacific, and thereafter, effectively, the United States is an Asian power. So when you look at the various political dynamics, power dynamics within the region, after the Second World War, the United States has a very important presence. And one argument that is made is essentially the United States plays quite an important offshore balancing role within the region in the years after 1945. In a way, the sort of American presence, like in Western Europe, basically reduces the likelihood of conflict between the various Asian states. In fact, one thing I forgot to say when I did a sort of survey of the map is that relations between the various Asian states have historically been pretty difficult, not least because of Japan. I mean, Japan obviously has had a history of military aggression in the region. The Japanese basically turned Korea into a colony at the beginning of the 20th century. In the 1930s, they then annexed Manchuria, which is part of northern China here in 1931. Then they launch a war against China proper in 1937. So as a consequence of this, I mean, Japan's relations with a number of states in the region, but particularly Korea and China, have been incredibly difficult. So one consequence of the American presence, the fact that the United States, as I say, was occupying Japan, and also had a strong presence in South Korea as well, is that it sort of reduced the likelihood of tensions boiling over between the various Asian states. In fact, the American role in Japan has been quite similar to that of the American role in Germany. It basically sort of reassures Japan's neighbors that Japan is unlikely to become a major security problem. So as I say, the American presence sort of in Asia basically reduces conflict, the likelihood of conflict breaking out between the various Asian states. So the American presence basically leads to a greater degree of stability in the region. Chinese Revolution in 1949, so when China becomes communist, which comes as a massive shock to Washington in 1949, that also compels the United States to retain a significant sort of military presence in the region. And America, of course, goes to fight two major wars in Asia during the Cold War. The first, as we mentioned, is the war in Korea between 1950 and 1953, and then a second war in Vietnam. Less clear-cut in terms of how you would date that, but certainly American involvement really begins to significantly increase by the early 1960s until America's eventual withdrawal from South Vietnam in 1975. Okay, the American relationship with Japan. Again, I've already noted the fact that the United States occupies Japan, and it's chiefly the Americans. It's actually General MacArthur who basically becomes the supreme head of Japan briefly, sort of viceroy figure in Japan. It's MacArthur who basically oversees Japan's transition towards democracy. After 1945, basically, the United States also becomes Japan's chief security guarantor. Basically, I'll say this at the bottom there, a tacit bargain, tacit meaning an unspoken agreement emerges between the Americans and the Japanese that the United States would provide a security guarantee to Japan so that Japan would not need to militarize. In fact, the new Japanese constitution stipulates that Japan cannot spend more than 1% of its economy on defense. So the United States would become Japan's chief security provider and effectively allow the Japanese to rebuild their economy and become an extremely wealthy state. Basically, by the 1970s, 1980s, almost an economic superpower in its own right. But that Japan would essentially accept American political leadership. Okay, so Japan would accept a subordinate position in American alliance. And actually, if you look at the history of Japanese foreign policy, until fairly recently at least, Japan has accepted quite significant limitations. So as I say, not much in the way of defense spending, but also the fact that in terms of its foreign policy activities, it's mainly kind of limited to its own immediate area. Should also, one other thing to say about Japan, that although Japan becomes a democracy, it's a sort of Asian version of democracy. It's not a sort of liberal democratic state in the way that you see emerge in Europe in the years after the Second World War, in the case of Germany or something like that, in the sense that Japan more or less sort of becomes, I wouldn't say it's a one-party state, but one party basically sort of has a monopoly on power pretty much throughout the Cold War, and even into the kind of post-Cold War period. That's the Japanese Liberal Democratic Party, and that has very, very sort of close links with the United States. So it is, decidedly sort of pro-American, and Japan basically becomes, as I say, one of America's most important partners in Asia during this period. Japan would accept the subordinate position, have a small military, as I say, only 1% of its economy would be spent on defense. Japan would concentrate on economic growth, as I say, it would get rich. There were periodic tensions, though, historically between the United States and Japan, especially over Vietnam in the 1960s, although the government was not overtly critical of what the United States was doing in Vietnam. Public opinion in Japan was very, very strongly against the war in Vietnam in the 1960s, to the point at which the Japanese government did actually have to express some criticism. Relations between the trading relationship with Japan, again, very similar to what we're seeing today with China. Americans did actually begin to worry about the trading relationship with Japan in the 1980s. Again, I grew up in the 1980s, and as I say, relationship between Japan and the rest of the world quite similar to China and the rest of the world today, in the sense that Japan was producing an awful lot of products which we were buying, particularly electronic projects. This was the era, I suppose, where companies like Sony and what have you really come to the fore. And yeah, in America and in Europe as well, for that matter, there were there were worries about the sort of trade deficits which were beginning to which were beginning to widen quite significantly in the 1980s. To the point at which, I mean, again, I remember this quite well. By the early 90s, there was some discussion about the fact that maybe Japan could emerge as a sort of strategic competitor to the United States. Since then, I think worries about Japan have since been kind of eclipsed by China. But it was an indication, as I say, that there was an element of friction in the relationship. Some Japanese politicians in the 1990s, this is the sort of penultimate point on the slide here, argue that Japan should begin to adopt a more assertive policy. I think that, again, we'll get onto the sort of contemporary relationship in a moment, but that has become even more apparent under the current Japanese leadership. But in general terms, despite these occasional problems, the relationship between the United States and Japan has, for the most part, remained pretty stable. As I say, we'll get on to the sort of contemporary American-Japanese relationship in a moment. Before that, we'll just very quickly, I think, sort of sketch the sort of historical relationship between the United States and China. China itself, before we get on to the first point, I mean, China itself was riven by divisions in the 1920s and 1930s, to the point at which there is a civil war between basically Chinese nationalists and Chinese communists. That war is suspended after 1937 when Japan invades China. And in some ways you could make a good argument that the Second World War effectively begins in 1937 in Asia. And by virtue of the fact that the Chinese, both the communists and the nationalists are fighting Japan during the Second World War, China actually is seen as an ally of the Allied powers during the war. Once the war comes to an end, the civil war between the nationalists and communists resumed. The Americans do, I think in 1946, the Americans do attempt to try and mediate a settlement between the communists and the nationalists, but to no avail, and ultimately the Communist Party. You have the Chinese Revolution in 1949, and the Chinese communists come to power, which is, as I say, a major setback for American foreign policy. Suddenly the largest state in Asia, a population of hundreds of millions of people back in the 1940s, has now become communist, and that sets off what we call a Red Scare in Washington. Americans become increasingly alarmed, increasingly frightened about communism. The nationalists in China actually leave the mainland and set up their own government on Taiwan. And the American position in the 1950s and 1960s is that the Taiwanese Chinese government is the legitimate government of China. So the Americans have a policy of non-recognition of Red China, as it was often referred to. Relations between communist China and the United States in the 1950s and 1960s very much marked by acute hostility. This does not change until the beginning of the 1970s, when Richard Nixon, who despite having had a reputation of being decidedly anti-communist, it's actually Nixon who sort of reaches out diplomatically to China at the beginning of the 1970s, culminating in a very famous meeting in 1972, when Nixon visits China and meets with the Chinese communist leader Mao Zedong. You can see both of them in this photograph here, which is the start of a diplomatic rapprochement, meaning a relaxation of tensions between communist China and the United States. There are various reasons for that. Probably the single biggest is that both the Chinese communists and the United States had an antagonistic relationship with the Soviet Union. So so despite the fact that China was communist and the Soviet Union was communist, relations between the two countries had deteriorated very, very markedly. But there was also a desire on the part of the West to try and open up China. China in the 1950s and 1960s was very much a closed country. There wasn't much in the way of Western access to it. So relations begin to relax, as I say, in the early 70s. Mao Zedong dies in the mid-1970s. A new political leadership comes to power in China. And formal diplomatic relations established in 1979. In the 1980s, the new Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping begins to significantly reform the Chinese economy, and this is the moment where, if you like, the sort of the American-Chinese trading relationship begins to be established. So in the 1980s, the Chinese economy starts to rapidly grow. China industrializes very rapidly, and as I say, this begins, this means that China starts heading off in a trajectory towards the sort of economic superpower that it has become today. Korea, very quickly as well, will sketch out the main developments. I think we mentioned most of this in passing. Korea partitioned at the end of the Second World War along the 38th parallel. Communist government in the north, anti-communist, if I can put it that way, government in the south. South Korea, for pretty much throughout the Cold War, was basically an authoritarian state. So although it was not communist, it was certainly not particularly democratic either. But the war breaks out in 1950. The United States responds by sending American soldiers to fight in order to defend South Korea. The war drags on until 1953, whereupon a ceasefire is agreed. I should say, the war actually also involves China. Mao Zedong decides to send in Chinese volunteers, as they were referred to, but basically the Chinese army sent in to fight in Korea in 1951. For a time, the United States considers actually using nuclear weapons in Korea to end the war and perhaps dropping bombs on Chinese targets. In the event, a ceasefire is agreed in 1953. Korea remains divided. As we noted, South Korea basically becomes an important military base for the United States. So when the Cold War ends, the United States, we'll say that, remains an important security actor in the region. Strong military presence in Japan and South Korea. Japan, basically pretty pro-American, but as we noted, Americans do become concerned about the trade deficit with Japan in the 1980s, which kind of continues into the 1990s. Although I should say, Japan experiences this sort of economic miracle in the 1960s, 70s, all the way through to the 1980s. And then at the end of the 1980s, Japan goes into a major economic recession. And it's still, to which it still hasn't really fully recovered. There is a significant change in Japan's economic performance. As I say, Japan achieving spectacular growth rates, but then sort of hitting a wall, if you like, at the end of the 1980s. And it hasn't really, obviously Japan still remains an extremely rich country, a major economic power. But in some ways, as I say, China has sort of usurped Japan's position as being the major the major economy in the region, at least in terms of economic growth. Mentioned Korea, Korea, as I say, was basically an authoritarian state for pretty much the whole of the Cold War. But end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s, Korea sort of makes this transition to becoming a democratic, South Korea makes this transition to becoming a democratic state. Okay. As I mentioned earlier, relations between Japan and China have always been pretty tense for historical reasons, and that is still very much in evidence today. There are a number of sort of disputes between China and Japan, but some of them, part of the dispute is basically territorial, in the sense that Japan and China have sort of competing claims in the South China Sea, and some of these claims concern a small group of islands. I'm not entirely sure how to pronounce this, but which one side, I think the Chinese, if I'm correct, the Chinese call these small islands, which are uninhabited, meaning that there are no actual people living on these islands, but the Chinese call these islands the Senkaku, and the Japanese, I think this is the right way around, called the, what is that, Diaoyu? I'm not sure how to say that. But they're important for strategic reasons. As you can see, the island's significantly closer to China than Japan, fairly close to Taiwan. So the islands themselves are pretty important in sort of strategic terms, in terms of having a presence, conceivably, and they could be turned into some kind of military base. The map also notes there's a gas field not too far away. Which again, there's some sort of competition. China basically sort of claiming this area as being part of its territorial waters. The Japanese sort of disputing this. So that shows that even today, there are sort of competing claims. Equally, there are differences in terms of how the two countries sort of view their respective histories, and these are obviously two big powers in the region. As I said, the American presence to a large extent has sort of kind of contained the potential conflict between these two countries. But as I say, the disputes remain. And the possibility, there is certainly the possibility of conflicts breaking out. Or as we noted, Okinawa, which again is part of Japan, is quite a large island, located well away from Japan proper, but which is also an American military base, and again, not too far, in fairly close proximity to these disputed islands. So this is, I think, is quite a good example of a potential area of conflict which could involve China and Japan, but also, the United States has a very significant sort of military presence in the region, and the Americans have a significant influence when it comes to a significant interest, I should say, when it comes to Taiwan as well. A quotation which I believe is in the textbook, which alludes, I think, to the rather ambiguous relationship between the United States and China. China is a threat, China is a customer, China is an opportunity. You cannot ignore it. And yes, I think China is certainly all of those things from an American point of view. So East Asia, since the end of the Cold War, China remains the key trading partner. I think that's obvious. Okay, so billions and billions of dollars worth of trade are being done with China, but remains communist, remains democratic. There was a brief moment where it looked as though perhaps something quite significant politically could happen in China with the Tiananmen Square protests in 1989. Unlike Gorbachev, though, in Eastern Europe, Deng Xiaoping decides that he is going to crush the protest movement in China, and the Communist Party kind of secures its position, which for a brief moment leads to a distinct souring of relations. But 1990-91, relations between the United States and China are kind of quietly sort of re-established. Then in the 90s, the Clinton administration basically pursued a policy of constructive engagement. I think it's under Clinton in the 90s that Chinese-American trade really begins to flourish. And I think the feeling on the part of the United States is that engagement in China will prove to be a sort of moderating influence, that if China becomes a key American trading partner and it's integrated into the global economy, there is this sort of belief that China will ultimately become, to use a bit of jargon, I suppose, China will become a sort of stakeholder in the international system and become, essentially become a sort of moderate power. Also, China, it's not just China's not important just in terms of trade, but China also has purchased huge amounts of American debt. It says 1.3 trillion in 2007. Obviously, it will probably be significantly more than that. So basically, China has become an important part of America's financial system. I say that some in Washington view China as a strategic competitor. I wrote this slide a few years ago. I say some, I would say significantly more now. And Taiwan also remains a continual source of tension. So, as I say, it is the United States that is chiefly concerned with providing security for Taiwan. Although the relationship between the United States and Taiwan is rather ambiguous, because today, the United States does not actually diplomatically recognize Taiwan. Interestingly, shortly after Trump had been elected president in 2016, before he actually took office, Trump, I think, if I remember correctly, he took a phone call or he spoke to the Taiwanese president, and there were indications that perhaps the Trump administration might confer full diplomatic recognition on Taiwan. The Chinese response to that, the communist Chinese response to that, was so strong and so forthright that this idea, I think, was very quickly dropped by the Trump administration. But as I say, the relationship between Taiwan and the United States, rather ambiguous. Trump and China then. I mean, under Obama, I think Obama, before we get on to Trump, Obama talked about pivoting to more towards Asia. So Obama recognizing East Asia's sort of geopolitical importance. But I think there was generally still a feeling in the Obama administration that it was in the best interests of the United States to try and retain some sort of partnership with China. I think it's fair to say the Trump administration's relationship with China has been significantly more belligerent, despite the photograph here with President Xi. Another headline kind of alluding to, as I say, this sort of more belligerent relationship. Trump says China may be knowingly responsible for the virus. So Trump essentially pointing the finger, blaming the Chinese for the current epidemic that we're all experiencing. I think it's certainly true that in the last few years, relations between the United States and China have become significantly more strained. Trump, as president, has never accepted. This is the one thing I think Trump has been entirely consistent on, right, in terms of his politics from the 90s until he became president. Trump has never accepted that strong trading relations with other countries are necessarily beneficial to the United States. So he has always been critical of the Chinese-American trading relationship. One consequence of that is that since becoming president, Trump has unleashed a trade war against China. So Trump has imposed tariffs on a number of imports coming into China. The Chinese government has retaliated by doing the same thing. That said, Trump has actually, I think it's a significant feature of Trump's diplomacy, and we'll talk about this in relation to Korea. Significant feature of the Trump administration diplomacy is that Trump has tended to try and personalize relations with various leaders, including that of President Xi. So he's met one-on-one with Xi on a number of times. He's sort of publicly talked about how they are friends and have warm relations and all the rest of it. um, while simultaneously, as I say, sort of launching a trade war. That relationship almost has certainly sort of soured in the last few weeks, and it's going to be very interesting to see what the long-term impact of the coronavirus will be on the American Chinese relationship. I think Americans have become increasingly critical of China. There's a feeling that the Chinese mishandled, did not manage well the initial outbreak of the virus in China, that they were misleading, that they did not inform the world. And essentially, as I say, opinion has moved. Trump's position on China and the virus, that's interesting. That has kind of moved quite significantly. Back in February, he basically praised President Xi. He said the Chinese authorities were doing a good job. Since the virus has become a sort of global epidemic, and since it's really kind of struck the United States, Trump's position, as I say, has become much, much more critical of the Chinese. And as I say, it will be very interesting to see if the virus has some kind of long-term consequences for the American-Chinese relationship. I think one potential consequence is that it's sort of exposed how vulnerable the United States is, having so much, being so reliant on China in terms of its trading relationship. The one thing that the crisis has revealed is that virtually all the world's antibiotics, for example, are actually produced in China. Most of the kind of protective equipment that doctors and nurses are produced in China. So I'm sure there will be a sort of long, hard look at whether, strategically it is such a good idea to be so reliant on China for the production of these kinds of things. So China, obviously a big dimension when it comes to America's Asian problem. The other is North Korea. I think it's fair to say North Korea has been a long-standing problem for the United States throughout the Cold War into the 90s. And all the way up until the present day. And before I get on to talking a little bit about Trump's diplomacy, and I think it would be fair to be pretty critical of the way Trump has handled America's relations with North Korea. It's worth noting, though, that no American president, whether it's Obama or Clinton or Bush, in the early 2000s, have managed to come up with a very effective policy for managing the Korean problem. Headline here from a few years ago. It's got stern test for Kerry over Korea. This was from the BBC website. Kerry was Obama's Secretary of State, which again just illustrates the fact that Korea is not a new problem. As I say, North Korea is probably the single biggest area of instability. It's a communist country, but it has a leadership which is inclined to take actions which are potentially quite destabilizing across the area. The one thing the North Koreans want above all else is to develop nuclear weapons. The main reason for that is that the North Korean leadership feels that a nuclear-armed Korea will be much, much more secure when set against outside intervention. The Koreans, for example, look at what happened to Saddam Hussein in Iraq or Colonel Gaddafi in Libya, and I think the conclusion that they have drawn from that is that if you want to ensure that there will be no outside interference in their affairs, then they need to become a nuclear state. Obviously, the United States, but not just the United States, Japan as well, especially, but also other countries in the region, are very anxious to prevent, North Korea now does have nuclear weapons, but they are very anxious to disarm North Korea. So this, as I said, this has been a long-standing problem. In the 1990s, the Clinton administration tried to negotiate some kind of framework agreement with North Korea, whereby the Americas would provide economic assistance to North Korea in return for North Korea agreeing not to develop nuclear weapons. That agreement has basically sort of collapsed. It should also be said, I mean, the problem the Americans have faced from the beginning is trying to find a way of getting North Korea to comply with these sorts of arrangements. And yes, the compliance mechanisms have been the single biggest problem. After 9/11, the Bush administration, so this is after 2001, the Bush administration just labelled North Korea as being part of an axis of evil. So after 9/11, the implication was that perhaps the United States would take some sort of military action against North Korea. Yet, after the United States ran into problems in Iraq, the thought of launching some sort of some sort of military intervention against North Korea, I think, became pretty much untenable. One story that was revealed a few years ago was from WikiLeaks, which indicated in conversations between American and Chinese diplomats in secret, this was not meant for public consumption, but the position of the Chinese, I think, seems to have been that probably unification between North Korea and South Korea would be almost inevitable at some point in the future. Although for the Chinese, problem for the Chinese was that if Korea became unified, then they might be faced with the possibility of having American troops ending up on their own border, which is obviously something that the Chinese would be very keen to avoid. Then there's the position of South Korea. I mean, I think the nightmare for South Korea is what might happen if North Korea were to in some way implode. What if the regime did come to power? You could be faced with a massive refugee crisis with millions of thousands or millions perhaps of North Koreans crossing the border into the south. North Korea itself is economically in a very bad state. So again, I think the South Koreans have sort of mixed feelings about the idea of perhaps having to take on that problem of being responsible for that part. So it's not, it's not necessarily the case that the South Koreans are particularly enthusiastic about the prospect of unification. Trump's relationship, again, getting back onto the Trump administration and North Korea. The photograph here shows Trump meeting the current North Korean leader, Kim Il-jong. Should be said, at the time of this lecture, Kim Il-jong has sort of disappeared from the public view, and there are questions surrounding his health. One or two, there's even some speculation that he might even have died, although that has yet to be confirmed. It's not entirely sure, as what his presence is, but if for some reason he has been incapacitated, or even died, no longer in charge, that could have some very, very important consequences, potentially destabilizing consequences for the region. As I noted at the beginning, when Trump became president, he did threaten North Korea with unleashing fire and fury against it if they continued to develop nuclear weapons, but then pursued a sort of volte-face and indicated that he would be prepared to sit down and talk with the North Korean leader. And again, I mean, as I mentioned earlier in relation to China, a key feature of Trump's diplomacy is the emphasis that he puts on the personal relationship he has with various leaders, and this is certainly true with Kim Jong-un. He's met the North Korean leader 3 times now, 2 kind of summit meetings. The first, I think, was in Singapore in 2017. They met each other again, I think, in Vietnam, if I remember correctly, the following year. And also, there was a brief meeting between the 2 men on the border between North Korea and South Korea last year. Now, this is significant because Trump is the first American president to actually sit down and meet a North Korean leader. And it seems like Trump was sort of hoping that these sort of meetings would actually lead to a significant sort of breakthrough. Trump obviously likes to consider himself to be a deal-making president, somebody, as a businessman, he was somebody who thought he could actually win agreements. The article, the text that I kind of sent you to accompany with this class, though, is I think, a very good analysis, if you like, of the shortcomings of Trump's diplomacy. So although that seems like the relations between the two were reasonably cordial when they have met, that has not translated into significant concessions. And one argument for that is that it's not entirely clear exactly what the Trump administration wanted to achieve from this. And the article that I sent to a company makes the point that perhaps the Trump administration, despite its friendly tone, was simply demanding much more than the North Koreans were willing to accept. Essentially, the Trump administration was demanding complete denuclearization of North Korea without withdrawing its own nuclear weapons from South Korea in return for some sort of economic package, some sort of economic deal, which the North Korean leadership of Kim Jong-un simply, that was not enough to persuade the North Koreans to engage in this. So despite these very high-profile meetings, it's not at all clear that the relationship between North Korea and the United States has been transformed. The underlying areas of dispute, the fact that North Korea has nuclear weapons and is showing no signs of being prepared to dismantle them, and has continued with nuclear testing, that is still that still continues to be a problem. So in the 21st century, well, I mean, the chapter from the textbook which accompanies this, I mean, the conclusion in the textbook, and it was written a few years ago now, I mean, the conclusion there is reasonably sort of optimistic in the sense that, the argument Cox advances is that there is unlikely to be, the possibility of conflict breaking out in the region is fairly remote, that because of economic growth, the fact that, the various countries in the region, China and Vietnam, Japan, they're all prioritizing their trading relationships, that's resulting in a very high level of economic integration. The fact that the Japanese have historically been pretty restrained in their foreign policy, all of that, Cox suggests that some sort of major conflict breaking out in the region seems unlikely. As I say, that was written a few years ago. I would say from the perspective of 2020, I'm not sure I would be so optimistic about it now. I mean, the one thing that has become very apparent in the last few years is that China clearly has plans to become a major power, not just in East Asia, but beyond East Asia. So there's a clear sort of clash between, if you like, Chinese ambitions and America's role in the region. And as I said, that has become more evident. The other big change, I would say, and again, I didn't really talk about this when we mentioned China, but it's important to note, is that China's military capabilities are increasing quite dramatically. So the gap between the United States and China in terms of their respective military capabilities, that is beginning to narrow. So the United States does not have the sort of hegemonic military presence in East Asia that it did, say, certainly 20 years ago, maybe as few as 10 years ago. Now, there's still a gap between the United States and China, but the gap is nothing like so big, especially the fact that the Chinese are now actually investing more resources in their navy. They now have weapons, missiles, which they could use against American warships, for example. So whereas in the past, the Americans had almost certainly had the sort of capacity to sail their ships through the Pacific almost at will. I think that period is now coming to an end, and that's going to be interesting to see how that sort of dynamic works its way out. Will the United States be able to maintain its dominant sort of military position in the region, given the fact that, as I said, China is now becoming an increasingly important military presence in the region itself. So yeah, I think the American-Chinese relationship is something that's going to be very interesting to see how that develops in the coming years. And yes, America and China remain very tightly integrated in economic terms, but will that be enough to sort of contain the increasing sort of political rivalry between the two states? So as I say, I would be perhaps slightly less optimistic than Cox was when he wrote his chapter a few years ago. As I say, I think the American-Chinese relationship potentially could become quite difficult in the years ahead.